Imagine, it is the year 2051. It's been 24 years since the first headlines came out. The headlines describing this new world that they said that had arrived. In the past, humans had to brutally wage war against one another to secure their freedom. Millions upon millions of lives were dragged under in this way. But they said we were no longer in the past. They said we had reached a point in our technological advancement where we were able to stand for our freedom without sacrificing our lives. Self-governing automation, they said, would secure this freedom without sacrificing our lives. But it failed. 3 years later, war broke out. Governments saw this as a perfect time to use automation to demonstrate its saving power. But it failed. Innocent civilians were slaughtered in huge swaths due to unseen combat situations, and morale spiraled into oblivion. Automation didn't save humanity from the horrors of war, but dragged us under with its empty promises deeper and deeper into an artificial world where at last the final flame of morality amid the darkness of war would go out. Automation, self-governing automation, should never have been put behind the wheel of one of the most delicate scenarios in human history: combat. Now, thankfully, this isn't happening today at this scale, but we are at a point in our decisions where the decisions we make now will affect the course of humanity. We have moved into an age of automation, and the decision must be made. Should the use of self-governing automation in combat be considered immoral from a standpoint of preserving human life? Automation nowadays is commonly associated with machines and the AI of modern times. However, when we look at its definition, we begin to see that this doesn't necessarily have to be true. NASA researcher Lawrence J. Prinzel III defines automation as, quote, process of substituting some device or machine for some human activity, end quote. So as a whole, automation is anything that takes the task or a human potential further. For instance, when men began using sticks or rocks in combat, that was technically automation because it extended human potential and effectiveness. The evolution of automation can be traced back to the dawn of combat itself. The utilization of sticks became spears, spears to bows, bows to arrows, and arrows to slings. With each stage of this technological evolution, these tools came a step closer to the automation as we see today. At this point in history, there seemed to be no moral problem with using automation. However, moral problems began arising when newer forms of automation were being introduced with less specific targets and less specific boundaries, when humans began to have less and less control. One of the first of these new automations was something that has been a source of fear since its introduction whenever it was created, due to its indiscriminate killing: the landmine. The first, most rudimentary landmine can be ultimately traced back to its first guaranteed use in the early 13th century. Years later, in the American Civil War, the first modern landmine appeared in the mind of Confederate Army Gabriel J. Rains. It was very effective at killing, but in doing so, Rains had crossed a line. In using the mines, the targets were not clear, and the way of carrying out the mission was misty as well. Why? Well, the landmine is the first technological use of a form of self-governing automation in combat. The fuse is set, and there is nothing that the operator needs to do afterwards. Now, while they were deemed unethical, they were also deemed effective, and militaries around the world adopted this terrifying new form of automation. Throughout the next 100 years or so, more and more forms of landmines entered combat, each more devastating than the next. But the innocent casualties climbed as well. Something had to change, and finally, in 1997, the Mine Ban Treaty, which prevented the manufacturing, stockpiling, and use of landmines, was signed by 162 countries. People around the world recognized the unethicality and damage being done by these landmines and did something about it to help fix the problem. Now, in 2026, we are approaching that moral line once again. We have developed machines that can operate by themselves without human intervention, self-governed. Now, a Roomba vacuum that can clean your house while you're shopping isn't bad, but when we apply these same technologies and ideas when human lives are on the line, it begins to be a concern. In 2006, Samsung Techwin companies based in South Korea created one of the first laws, or lethal autonomous weapons systems. It was the SGR-A1 Autonomous Sentry, an unmanned autonomous sentry system which could do things developers at one point had only dreamed of. It had the capability to detect as well as engage and cut down any targets autonomously, if necessary, within a radius of 10 kilometers, which is approximately the distance of the place you are sitting now to the state capital. Nowadays, we have the Ripsaw M5, a cutting-edge tank developed by How and How Technologies alongside Textron Systems in 2019 for use by the U.S. Army. Similarly, the tank is equipped with amazing firepower and great maneuverability, along with the ability to seemingly operate autonomously, depending on what the objective is. But again, because the targets are so unclear and the distance between the operation between humans in charge and the physical machine doing the work, there's too big of a risk to use this in combat, and it should be considered immoral. Essentially, the raw question being asked at the heart of the matter is, should the use of self-governing automation in combat be considered immoral from a standpoint of preserving human life? Now, intelligent people on both sides of the argument can agree on a few things. First off, that human life is innately valuable and should be preserved to the highest degree. And secondly, that initially sending automation into combat scenarios will save human lives of those who would have to go otherwise, purely by taking their role in combat. However, this is only initially. Now, once again, to clarify, self-governing is defined by Oxford Languages as, quote, exercising control over one's own affairs, end quote. And again, laws or lethal autonomous weapon systems are, according to congress.gov, quote, a special class of weapon systems that use sensor suits and computer algorithms to independently identify a target and employ an onboard weapon system to engage and destroy the target without human control of the system, end quote. Now, because we are living in an age where technology as well as AI are growing rapidly, and because these are being applied to life-threatening situations, making the decisions now is critical. Concerns about the use of laws have been brought up in the Geneva Convention, but progress is slow and the decision must be made. Now, two main reasons, each with subpoints, exist that underscore the immorality of self-governing automation in combat. And the first concerns the self-governing automation's physical capabilities in combat. Knowing who the enemy is and who the innocent bystanders are is essential in preserving human life. To implement self-governing automation into battle zones, it must be able to effectively identify people using facial recognition systems, or FRSs for short. However, in our current day and age, these systems are simply inadequate. In combat, change is constant, and it is impossible to perceive which human target will be encountered when, or even what they will be wearing. So there are two main variables that are unplanned and could compromise the identification process. In 2018, an MIT study tested the consistency and accuracy of automated facial recognition systems and gathered 1,270 different people from around the world and determined whether the facial recognition system could determine their gender, approximate age, and race. FRSs from major companies such as IBM, Face++, and Microsoft, and it's identified up to 34.7% participants in certain classifications. That comes almost to a coin toss. So it is evident that in today's age, automation cannot be relied upon to correctly identify targets. Maybe one day we will develop automation that is capable of doing this, but for now, automation must be labeled insufficient. However, even if automation could discern between civilians and combatants, it would be severely unprepared for combat in its present state, because combat is all about change, which leads to the second reason why the use of self-governing automation in combat should be considered moral. Combat is very unpredictable and things rarely go as planned. To retaliate against attacks and enemy strategies, a soldier must have the ability to adapt thoroughly. As Prussian Field Marshal Helmut von Moltke once said, highlighting the absolute necessity of adaptation in combat, quote, no plan survives contact with the enemy, end quote. Automation is incapable of adapting to surrounding circumstances adequately. It may be able to follow orders in a controlled environment, but as unseen variables and unexpected causes are introduced, we don't know if automation will be able to respond correctly. Obviously, it is physically incapable of programming every single little scenario into its database, and we essentially have to leave it up to chance whether it will respond or not. Innocent human lives are at stake in almost every combat situation, and sending in automation that isn't capable to adapt and change effectively is truly a foolish thing to do. If the goal is to preserve human life, we mustn't do this. Now, the second reason why self-governing automation fails to preserve human life in combat deals with the overall effect that automation has on war-oriented decisions, which should be justifiable according to St. Thomas Aquinas' just war theory developed in the 13th century. His accepted theory is that for war to be just, it must be so in three separate respects. War must be justified in why it is being waged, or just as bellum, how it is being raised, or just in bellum, and the aftermath of the conflict, or how it is handled after the fact, which is just post bellum. Now, if we evaluate the use of automation in combat through the lens of just war theory, we can see that it not only violates one aspect, but all three aspects respectively in turn. First is justice in going to war, or just as bellum, meaning not going to war for just any reason, but as only a last resort, or the only last reason, and it must be just in doing so. When automation is fighting our battles for us, in theory, fewer people will be losing our lives, but only in theory, because as we have seen from my previous proofs, this is not the case, and it will end up just taking more lives than it's saving. So if governments think that whenever they use automation to wage war, fewer people will die, they'll see it as a less risky option, or a less serious option. Governments will be more likely to go to war, and inadvertently, this is taking more human lives in the process, just as we have seen in the past when governments and countries were more willing to enter war whenever they had developed certain technologies of great power. The Council of Foreign Regulations wrote an article in 2021, quote, "While a balance of power isn't enough to stop countries from fighting, an imbalance can certainly encourage aggression, as was seen in the lead up to the Second World War. After World War I, the victors, all exhausted by war, reduced the size of their militaries and placed limits on the warships that they could build. But by the early 1930s, the military balance began to disappear as Germany in particular increased its military might." End quote. The truth is that war will only end when people die. More war still means war death, regardless of the use of automation. So when we use automation in combat, war is less serious of an option, and thus more lives will be lost that shouldn't be. Thus, this corrupts the decision of going to war, and the use of automation becomes directly immoral. However, even if during war and post-war decision-making, automation impacts the morality of war negatively. The second way that automation violates just war theory, or just in bellum, is the failure to protect civilians and combatants alike, as we've seen in my earlier proofs about facial recognition systems and adaptability. If war is conducted in a moral manner, such as using automation, then the war is not justified, and the decision on how to act in war is corrupted. Now, the last aspect of just war theory has to do with post-war situations and how they're handled, or just post-bellum. How war crimes are handled and how the victorious rule and treat the non-victorious. Obviously, if a soldier commits a war crime during war, after the fact, he or she will be held accountable for their actions. Now, what if this happens, for instance, a self-governing automated unit misidentifies a village church as an enemy bunker and blows it up? Normally, the soldier who did this deed would be held accountable, but in this case, is there someone to blame? We can't blame it on the automation itself, because after all, it's just a bunch of metal with codes running through its synthetic veins. Who's to blame? The programmer? The engineer who put it together? We don't know. Here lies the problem. There is no one to blame. So here is where responsibility and accountability go to die. Nobody can be accurately pinned down as a mission failing, and so all sense of responsibility and accountability are lost, and the post-war decisions become corrupted. So as a whole, automation violates all three aspects of Thomas Aquinas' just war theory, making war waged with self-governing automation unjustified and immoral. We can see that automation is far from the perfect soldier that it claims to be. With its physical, moral, and just deficiencies, this ideal soldier that was supposedly going to revolutionize war in a good way simply comes crashing down upon further examination. The use of self-governing automation in combat should be considered moral from the standpoint of preserving human life. However, common views for automation may point out that automation is capable of outperforming humans with increased precision and efficiency. This is apparent from everyday items that are manufactured by automated systems, such as cars and household items, where you're able to get the exact same product every single time. Perfect. Well, while it is true that automation can regularly outperform humans in specific, basic pre-programmable tasks, it does not perform on the same level with more complex tasks, into which combat would fall. The role that automation would take up in combat is no simple task. A good example of this was seen in 2023 when General Motors subcompany Cruise released driverless cars that could be hailed over and could transfer you to your desired location. However, it was shortly seen that just because the individual parts of the vehicle systems were better than human performance didn't mean that the vehicle functioned safely and better than a human. On October 2nd, 2023, a traffic incident occurred in San Francisco, California, involving one of Cruise's driverless cars, in which a pedestrian who was hit by another vehicle fell into the path of a Cruise car. The car stopped, then followed its program and pulled over to a safe location, pinning the woman under one of its front tires and dragging her 20 feet to a curb, inflicting serious injuries on her. From this incident, we can see that while automation may be able to outperform humans in specific programmable situations, it simply cannot in real-world situations such as traffic or combat. Another argument for automation that was laid out by the Emory University Press in 2017 was, quote, "The judgment of autonomous weapon systems will not be clouded by notions such as fear or hysteria, and the systems will be able to process much more incoming sensory information than humans without discarding or distorting it to fit preconceived notions," end quote. In any situation a human enters, they walk in with these underlying notions as well as emotions. With the use of automation, however, it is commonly argued that these scenarios would not occur, seeing as automation does not have emotions that could potentially cloud its decisions, but it will always stick to the programming. However, it takes some human aspects for combat to be conducted effectively, and one of these aspects is emotional intelligence, which humans alone possess. In certain combat scenarios, this faculty of human nature is required to obtain an effective and moral outcome. The Air University of the United States Air Force put out an article addressing this in 2025. Quote, "In the U.S. Air Force, where airmen operate advanced weapon systems, emotional intelligence is no longer optional, it's essential," end quote. The human brings an essential aspect to combat, helping us respond to the unexpected and respond to the unprogrammable. That's why humans have these instincts and emotional hysteria responses to help them immediately without having to calculate, to help us survive and preserve human life. So while automation seems like a good idea on the surface, when we dive deeper into the physical as well as moral roadblocks that using automation in combat provides, we see that it truly does not fulfill its promises. Automation fails us in three main ways. It is incapable of physically performing all of the capabilities necessary for an effective and safe combat. 2, it corrupts and erodes our morality with its cold, unsympathetic nature. And finally, it causes humans to make light of other humans' lives and their decision-making, shrinking them to mere pawns on a chessboard. Using this seemingly beneficial tool will always come with the same price: the degradation of human life. Genesis 1:27a states, quote, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him," end quote. We are mirrors of God's very being, his most valued creation, something to be loved, something to be treasured. Even in combat scenarios and seemingly material situations, a discard for regard of human life is to discard what God has willed for us. We as Christians are called to shine the light of Christ in all spheres of our lives. In our lives, we shouldn't just choose the easiest path for ourselves when things get stressful. Rather, even in those situations, we must consider others and how our actions and words can affect them. So, here we are, teetering on the brink of a new age of technology where everyone, everywhere is promising us everything. It could make life easier for some of us. We as humanity have this choice now. Are we going to take this step with this new age of morally twisted technology, or are we going to take the steps necessary to stop this movement because we know what's right? It's the year 2026. What do we want the future headlines to say? The headlines of the world that is coming. Do we want this world to save humanity? The future is still in our hands. The choice is ours today. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. We will now begin our thesis defense. Will, are you ready for your first question?
Yes, sir.
You spoke about some of these lethal autonomous weapon systems. These laws could be 10 kilometers away, you said, probably the state capitol building about here. Are we right to understand that there could be laws over there that could be set to attack somebody in this area, like right in this church?
Yes, sir. So it has the ability to identify, as I said before, and obviously if it's programmed into it for it to take this such action without human intervention, it is capable of doing that. Yes, sir.
Okay. Another question, just to make sure that the audience understands, to clarify, is it so much that you're against the automation itself, or the fact that it's self-governing?
The self-governing automation and everything that kind of comes with it. Some of the points that I made, such as like the negative influence of humans not actually participating in war, those effects reach beyond self-governing automation, but specifically the main points I brought up in the beginning of my speech are regarding self-governing automation and the negative effects it has on those three main aspects of combat.
Okay, would you have a problem with a drone that a soldier is operating by remote?
So even if that wouldn't be necessarily self-governing automation, so a couple of the points that I talked about wouldn't be applied to that. However, if it was manually being controlled by the drone, we still have this problem that I brought up before about this removal of humans from combat. It would seem that it would save more human life because humans aren't actually in war, but the effects of that ideology on all of the decisions concerning war, such as, oh, this can be saving you more human life, we should, war isn't going to be as serious of an option, would ultimately lead to more death because, as I said before, war will always lead to more death. There's not going to be a situation where two countries are like, oh, you killed all of my automated units, I'm just going to surrender now. No, humans will come in next, and ultimately, more war still means more death.
I do have a question about that coming up in a second. I'm glad you touched on that. Let me ask you this. One of the reasons you're against self-governing automation is that robots cannot readily identify targets. And you talked about facial recognition software, and they may accidentally kill innocent civilians. But what about a situation where a human soldier fights alongside a self-governing machine, where maybe there's a kill switch to stop the machine, or let's say that there's a low percentage of a chance that there would be civilians in the vicinity where the human has some control over it. Would you talk about maybe the ethics behind that?
Of course. Could you give me just a second to look at my notes?
Yes.
All right. So even in situations where there is this monitor, and obviously the automation is governing itself, but kind of being overseen, there's still two main problems that would arise. The first one, which concerns the loop of control. Now, in these certain situations where there are overseers overseeing like different units of automation, or even fighting alongside automation, there's not going to be undivided attention on one specific unit of automation. For instance, there could be 3 separate units, and there's one military personnel that's kind of overseeing it all. They're not going to have their undivided attention on one specific unit, and that creates, or really just any other distraction, whether it's something one other unit is doing, or even like something back where the actual person is sitting and overseeing it. Any distraction such as that could take away, and then we still have the same problem of automation being left unchecked. So even whenever it is overseeing, there's still not going to be that undivided attention that the human is overseeing whenever they're supposedly monitoring. And secondly, the idea of a kill switch doesn't necessarily solve the problem, because if you're sending in these units to complete a mission and something goes awry and they hit a kill switch and the automation shuts down, what happens to the rest of the mission? Well, it's still going to fail, and that could ultimately still lead to the loss of more human life. So ultimately, having monitors over this automation or even having a kill switch won't necessarily fix the problem.
Thank you for the distinction. Next question. When, for example, the automobile was invented, people complained that the dangers of replacing the horse and buggy with cars. They would say things, the cars are too fast to be safe, or they could malfunction and hurt people. We now see these arguments as misguided. We all use cars to get here. The people that, it seemed like the people were afraid of the new technology. We view the anti-car people as stopping progress. Are you guilty of the same thing? Here, are you only fearful of the self-governing automation because it is new and different?
I think rather than just being fearful of what automation is bringing on because it's new and different, is because it really crosses this line that we've never really crossed before, where we're creating something that can operate entirely by itself. Obviously, when we all drove our cars here, we were sitting at the steering wheel and in charge of what was happening. However, in automation, while we are programming it to perform a certain way and complete these certain tasks, ultimately, after we let it go, it's working by itself. So I would say that this is a completely new, I'd say, genre of technology that we're developing, where there's a lot more questions such as I've addressed today coming into play. I wouldn't say this is just because it's a new technology that we're being wary of.
Okay. You suggest that self-governing automation violates Thomas Aquinas' view of just war theory, because countries will be more likely to go to war because they see automation as saving lives wrongly believing that war will be less risky. You argue that this would lead to more deaths. But is it possible that we might find a future where countries only use self-governing automation to fight wars? That only robots are sent into war, and the loser of the war submits to the demands of the winner without shedding human blood? Would not this outcome justify the use of self-governing automation in the future?
I think in a situation where we have countries that are simply going to surrender once all of their automated units or their robots, we can say for simple terms, are destroyed, I think that's an unrealistic way of looking at the future, because at that point, why don't we just play a game of chess to see who can take over another person's country? So ultimately, we're always going to want to go that little extra bit once our automation is destroyed to have this final push in this battle or situation, whatever one country's trying to achieve their goal, they're always going to end up sending in humans. I don't think we're ever going to achieve a point where we're just sending in robots, because the whole point is that we're trying to accomplish something and we're going to give that our all, and our all would include sending in human soldiers, and ultimately that would loop back around to lives being lost. So using this automation would still lead to more loss of life.
Okay. All right, last question. You suggest more innocent civilians will die if we allow self-governing automation. In 1968, Americans were horrified to find out that evil was committed by American soldiers in what we now call the My Lai massacre. Soldiers from all countries, have the capacity to act sinfully on purpose. If it could be demonstrated that fewer innocent civilian lives are lost due to self-governing automation than to the actions of sinful humans, would you change your stance?
Thank you for your question. I would say no, because while it would be great if automation could save more lives than it would be taking directly, I think we're still going to have this problem that I kind of brought up at the end of my speech about the overall negative impact of automation on combat decisions. So if it could, in the moment, save more human lives, we'd still have this lingering negative effect upon war in general, such as decisions in going to war, decisions in war, as well as decisions after war, that would be kind of corrupted by this idea of using this expendable automation that wouldn't really affect human lives. So because that is faulty, I would say that my point still stands that automation shouldn't be used, because it still has this negative effect. Even if it could save more lives, like in that moment, there would still be that negative effect and that overall negative loss of life.
All right, thank you. This concludes our thesis defense.